Hello everyone, welcome back. This is the first in a series of lectures on proximate analysis techniques. We will begin our discussion of proximate analysis by examining the field of neuroethology. Now, before we can really talk about neuroethology as an approach to examining animal behavior, first we've got to get into some of the nitty-gritty details of neurobiology, starting with hormones and the organ system that produces them, which is called the endocrine system. Now, the endocrine system is made up of a series of glands and certain organs that secrete a type of chemical called hormones. Now, hormones play a variety of roles in the body, but they are best thought of as chemical messengers. They send instructions from one part of the body to another to enact physical change. Now, some examples of glands that participate in the endocrine system: the adrenal glands. These are located right above the kidney and are probably most famous for secreting the hormone epinephrine, which is more commonly known as adrenaline. It tends to trigger the fight or flight response in most animals. The pituitary gland is located in the midsection of the brain. It is connected to another part of the brain called the hypothalamus, and they overlap a bit in their function. The pituitary is sometimes called the master gland because it regulates a whole lot of different bodily functions, including things like growth, a little bit of metabolism, and also reproductive development and reproductive function. Now, the hypothalamus, on the other hand, is a little bit different. It regulates some daily activities like your daily metabolism, feeling hungry, feeling thirsty, as well as your energy balance, how you budget your bodily energy for different activities, and also your body's temperature. Okay? The thyroid gland is not located in the brain. It's actually located deep in your throat. And it plays also a role in metabolism and also a role in your growth. Okay? It secretes a steady amount of certain hormones into your body system to help regulate your body and maintain what's called homeostasis, or sort of standard operating temperatures, standard operating speed for your metabolism. The thyroid helps keep your body systems stable. Now, there's a lot of glands that aren't listed here, but these are the main ones that we will talk about. There are also many organs that participate in the endocrine system and release hormones. The pancreas, for example, releases a hormone called insulin, which participates in glucose breakdown or sugar digestion, and also your gonads, which are either the testes in males or the ovaries in females. And these tend to release reproductive hormones or participate in reproductive hormone cycling. Now, hormones often don't act alone. Frequently, one hormone will trigger the release of another, which will then trigger the release of another. These are called cascade effects, and you can think of them sort of as like a domino effect. When hormone A is released, it actually triggers the release of hormone B, which triggers the release of hormone C, which actually causes something to happen. Okay, some sort of change in the body. So, for example, there's something called the HPA axis. I know axis is way over here on the other side of the parentheses, but HPA stands for hypothalamic, pituitary, and adrenal axis, but we call it HPA for short. Now, the HPA axis has a pretty strong role to play in dominance behavior in animals. Okay? So here's how this works. If you are a submissive animal, like this fox here, we can tell that this fox is acting submissive because his ears are down. He's not making direct eye contact with the fox whose face is up here. Okay? His body posture is very low to the ground. His tail is tucked underneath him. This is clearly a submissive fox. Right? Now, what's causing this fox to act submissively? Well, it's in the presence of a more dominant fox. This fox right here, who is more dominant. Okay? I can tell because this fox is standing upright, while this fox is crouched down, indicating a dominance and submissive relationship. Now, the submissive animal, when it's in the presence of the more dominant animal, is actually experiencing a hormone cascade. A hormone called CRH, which stands for corticotropin releasing hormone, is produced from the hypothalamus. All right. The CRH is then sent to the pituitary. This causes the pituitary to release its own hormone called ACTH. This stands for adrenocorticotropin hormone. Okay. That ACTH then is sent down to the adrenal glands, which are located just above the kidneys. The adrenal glands then produce a third hormone called cortisol. Cortisol has a variety of effects, but one of the most important in this circumstance is it reduces aggressive behavior. So long as this submissive animal is in the presence of the more dominant animal, CRH will be released from the hypothalamus, which will then trigger the release of ACTH from the pituitary, which will in turn trigger the release of cortisol from the adrenals, which will reinforce this animal's submissive behavior. Now, this is beneficial to this animal because if its interactions with this more dominant individual have indicated to it that this individual is a better fighter, stronger, maybe more aggressive, what that means is that if our submissive individual were to try to fight the more dominant individual, they'd probably lose and be injured in the process. So if this submissive individual can see that all of these things are true, just by looking at this more dominant individual, or maybe based on his interactions with the more dominant individual in the past, he can save himself a lot of physical hardship and damage by simply acting submissive whenever the more dominant animal is around. This hormone cascade helps reinforce that submissive behavior, which is better overall for our submissive fox's survival. Now, hormones tend to be very, very specific in the messages that they send. And they don't send messages to just any old place in the body. Hormones are incredibly targeted, and the cells that can actually receive messages from hormones have dedicated receptors, which is a part of the cell membrane, it's on the surface of the cell, that will only fit certain hormones. So particular hormones will only be effective at very specific receptors on very specific cells. These cells that are actually able to receive hormone messages are called target cells. They're the target for the hormone. And these target cells are located in certain parts of the body where the effects of that hormone are going to be most profound. So for example, birds have target cells located in their brains that are receptive to just certain hormones. A lot of mating behavior in birds is actually hormone regulated, and it's related directly to the time of year. Birds tend to only mate during the spring and summer. This makes sense. This is when the weather is warmest and when the most food is available, which means that offspring survival will be at its peak. Okay? So how do birds tell when the seasons are changing? How do they know when the seasons are changing from, say, winter into spring? The most reliable indicator of seasonal change are actually the changes in day length. Remember that in the northern hemisphere especially, which is where the majority of songbird habitat is, temperate forests in the northern hemisphere, days get shorter during the winter and they get longer during the spring and summer. Changes in day length actually correspond to changes in hormone production. Testosterone production in the brains of male birds actually increases with day length. So testosterone production goes up and up as winter moves into spring and then as spring moves into summer. Testosterone is a hormone that then will travel to the brain and bind to the receptor cells, also called target cells, located in the male brain. And those hormones will then increase that male bird's aggressive behavior. And it'll trigger what's called mate guarding behavior, which is where male birds, like this guy right here, will fight other males in order to protect the females in his territory. Aggression in this case is directed towards competitors, specifically competing males. Okay? It's also directed towards any nest predators that may come and attempt to steal eggs from the nests after they've been laid. Now, this is all helpful behavior, but only when it's the right time of year to reproduce. You don't want to lay eggs during winter when the eggs will be too cold to develop. So mating behavior is really only adaptive when it's done during warm weather in spring and summer. So it only makes sense for males to be aggressive and actively courting females or guarding them from other males when weather conditions are appropriate for reproduction. When the weather changes, when the amount of daylight decreases and the days become shorter because it's winter, the males will stop this aggressive behavior, and they'll ignore any other males that are in the area because it's not the right time to be behaving aggressively to mate, because mating most likely won't be successful during this time of year. Now, hormones don't necessarily cause behaviors. They're not like an on-off switch where if a certain hormone is present, a behavior is definitely going to occur. Instead, what hormones do is they affect the likelihood that an animal is going to respond to a particular stimulus from their environment. Okay? Now remember, stimuli are features of the environment that trigger behaviors. Whether or not an animal is hypersensitive to a stimulus can be influenced in part by what hormones are present in their system. And the intensity of their response to that stimulus is also going to be affected by the presence or absence of hormones. Now, there are three interacting systems in an animal's body that mediate their response to a stimulus. There's the sensory system, which is collecting information from the environment. So down here on our diagram, our sensory systems might consist of our eyes, ears, nose, and any other senses that we use to pick up information from our environment. All that information, though, then has to be processed. Our processing center is also called our central nervous system, which is this centermost bubble. This is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. Sensory information is sent to the central nervous system where it's processed, and decisions can be made based on the information provided from the senses. The central nervous system can then choose whether or not it wants to react. Reaction is the third system. Reactions to stimuli take place via effectors. Effectors are the parts of your body that are actually going to move or react. Okay. So your effectors will be things like your muscles, which will move your skeleton. Perhaps your organs will have to participate as well. But your effectors are the parts of your body that are actually going to be changed in order to respond to your stimulus. They're the parts of the body that will enact the behavior that your central nervous system decides to use in response to the stimulus. Okay? And then what we will see those effectors manifesting is this last bubble, the behavior itself. Okay. Now, these three systems all interact with each other. They are not necessarily just going to participate in a linear flow of information like what I just drew. Sensory systems can send information straight to the brain, and the brain will then make a decision that it definitely wants to react based on that information, and a behavior will then manifest. Okay? But there's all sorts of feedback that takes place between these three systems while that main transmission of information is happening. The central nervous system may request more information from the sensory systems. It might ask how far away a competitor is, not just whether or not a competitor is present. It may ask what that competitor smells like, and it's going to request constant updates on what that competitor is doing in response to its own animal's behaviors. Effectors are going to send information back to the brain on how much energy they have, whether or not they're being overstressed, how well they're working, etc. Okay. And then meanwhile, the behavior is having its own effects. That behavior is taxing the body as the effectors are working. That behavior is also going to be potentially changing the situation. Maybe it's scaring off the competitor, maybe it's simply making the competitor angry, and that's going to create more information for the sensory system to report to the brain. That behavior is also then going to create feedback for the central nervous system, whether the animal feels strong in its aggressive response to the competitor, whether it's confident in that response. So these three systems all interact with one another. But there's one more system at play that affects all three of these, but is only affected in turn by one, and that's hormones. Hormones can be triggered by the central nervous system. Their production can be instigated by the central nervous system. Those hormones then will affect how sensitive a sensory system is. They will affect how strongly or quickly certain body systems can respond, so they can actually help speed up things like muscular movement. And the presence or absence of certain hormones, just before this behavior even takes place, the presence or absence of certain hormones can affect the decision-making of the brain itself, just like what we saw with those male birds. Presence of testosterone increased the odds that those male bird brains would choose to respond aggressively. And sometimes just enacting a certain behavior will actually increase the production of certain hormones as well. The testosterone and aggression feedback loop is a good example of this last point. In this feedback loop, when an aggressive interaction occurs and an animal is forced to behave aggressively, it may engage in a dominance fight. Now, that fight might be physical, or it might just involve posturing, like snarling, growling, puffing yourself up to make yourself look bigger. All of those, though, count as a conflict. And if the animal wins that particular conflict, it actually boosts the production of testosterone in their system. That makes them more likely to engage in another aggressive conflict. If they win that one as well, that also boosts the amount of testosterone in their system, making them even more likely to engage in another aggressive interaction. The cycle of winning interactions and producing more testosterone is actually what establishes dominant behaviors in a dominant animal. Now, there are certain hormones that are associated with very stereotypical and distinctive responses, regardless of the animal that's hosting the hormone. One of those really distinctive suites of behavior is often referred to as fight or flight behavior. The fight or flight reflex is a response to dangerous situations, and it's mediated by a set of endocrine cascade reactions. Now, this endocrine response to danger is pretty consistent across most vertebrates, and it looks something like this. A stressor, which is your stimulus, it's a negative stimulus, something bad is happening, causes your hypothalamus to activate two distinctive pathways. Now, these different pathways are going to happen simultaneously. Here's the first. Your adrenal glands are going to secrete a hormone called epinephrine. This is commonly referred to as adrenaline, but this is its formal name. Now, epinephrine binds to target cells located in a couple of different places: the heart, the lungs, and your blood vessels. In each of these places, epinephrine triggers the same basic response. The goal is to increase the flow of blood and oxygen to the muscles. So heart rate is going to increase, respiration rate is going to increase, and blood vessel activity is going to increase in order to ensure that the muscles are well oxygenated and have a solid supply of materials needed to allow them to move quickly and efficiently. This is to prep the body to either fight or to flee, depending on what the central nervous system decides to do. No matter which of these the central nervous system chooses, the body's going to have to respond physically, which means the muscles have to be primed. Now, at the same time this is happening, the hypothalamus itself is going to secrete hormones that are going to activate the pituitary. So the hypothalamus will use its own hormones to activate the pituitary. The pituitary then is going to send a different set of chemical signals to the adrenals. And it's going to cause the adrenals to release something other than epinephrine. Instead, the adrenals once again are going to release cortisol. Okay? So remember, in our first pathway, the hypothalamus activated a pathway that triggered the adrenal glands directly and caused them to secrete epinephrine. But then the hypothalamus is going to secrete a second hormone, a different hormone here, that will go to the pituitary first and get the pituitary to activate or to send out another hormone that will activate the adrenals. But in this case, the pituitary's hormones are going to tell the adrenals to secrete something other than epinephrine. Different hormone means different message, different set of instructions. The pituitary's request of the adrenals is to release cortisol. The hypothalamus's original request to the adrenals was to release epinephrine. Okay. Now, this process in pathway number 2 is a hormone cascade. It's a very obvious one, where one organ or gland releases a hormone, which triggers another gland to release another hormone, which then triggers a third gland to release a third hormone. The whole point of this is to produce cortisol, which is then going to encourage the body to convert carbs into sugars, which will then help power our muscles. Again, we want the muscles to be well powered so that they're ready to either put up a fight or to run away. Okay? So here we've ensured muscles have plenty of oxygen in pathway 1. And in pathway 2, we've ensured they have plenty of energy, plenty of fuel. The adrenals are also going to release, as a result of this second pathway, another hormone called aldosterone. Aldosterone actually boosts water retention, which creates swelling that helps to reduce bleeding in case of injury. So if an animal decides to fight instead of flee and it's cut or scratched or bitten in the process, this increased water retention will cause the tissue to swell, holding the wound shut somewhat, which will reduce the amount of blood that's lost. This is a great defense mechanism. All right. What we've just discussed is the endocrine system. Another system within the body that helps to regulate behavior very strongly is the nervous system. We're going to speak briefly about the nervous system here, and we'll be building on our knowledge of this system in later lectures. Now, the field of nervous system study as it pertains to behavior is referred to as neuroethology. Okay? So these are the impacts of the nervous system and its functions on the behavior of an animal. The nervous system itself is based on a special type of cell called a neuron. It's a highly specialized cell whose job it is to spread information through the body. The neuron consists of a few key parts. There's the cell body, which is this centralmost structure. This circle here in the middle is the nucleus. Okay. Attached to the cell body is this elongated tail called the axon. Okay. Axons transmit electrical impulses away from the cell body. Think of A for axon and A for away. Axons carry information from the cell body away and deliver it to its neighbors. Axon terminals, which are here at the end of the axon, are what actually send our either electrical or chemical messages from one neuron to the next. Neurons receive these chemical messages through these long, spiny structures. Okay. These are called dendrites. Okay. Dendrites receive these electrochemical messages. Dendritic spines are these little spines on the ends that increase the surface area of the dendrites. The gap between two neurons is called a synapse. It's this empty space, but we'll talk about that more in a moment. Here's how a neuron works. An external stimulus will trigger a neuron, but only if it exceeds that neuron's threshold. These neurons are sensitive, but only past a certain point. They're a little bit binary in their function. Either the cell will fire or it won't. There's no such thing as a faint signal from a neuron. Okay? So the way this works is, imagine you've got some pressure source. Okay, maybe this neuron is in your skin. Okay, and here we have maybe a needle pushing in on the skin. Now that's going to create pressure downward as the needle pushes into the skin. That's going to push on these dendritic spines. Now, if the dendritic spine is only pushed on a little bit, it actually won't cause the cell body to respond. It's too low. It's below this threshold that the cell needs in order to fire. But if that pressure gets stronger and stronger as this needle is pushed further and further into the skin, eventually the pressure will be strong enough it will hit the cell's minimum threshold and cause the cell body to fire a signal down the axon. There's only one signal strength here. Okay? So it's not like it can send a faint signal or it can send an extra strong signal. No, there's only one signal strength. So that's why the threshold is so important. The neuron itself doesn't have the ability to say, hey, I'm being touched very, very gently. And it doesn't have the ability to say, hey, I'm being really pounded on very, very hard. Instead, it can just send this one signal strength that says, I've been touched. And that's it. Okay? So what this does is it prevents the neuron from overwhelming its neighbors with too much information about every single tiny, tiny little contact it feels. It only sends information about stimuli that are sufficiently strong to overcome its threshold, which means the stimulus is probably a pretty big deal. Now, what if the stimulus is a really big deal? What if this needle has punched through into the body and is currently stabbing our neuron, causing actual damage? Then it's going to need to send an urgent message. The way that it sends an urgent message in response to a strong stimulus is by sending lots and lots of copies of the same message. The neuron will just fire over and over and over again. And in this way, it communicates to its neighbor that something urgent is going on. Okay. The neighbor then receives all of these messages, which indicates that it should probably send a whole lot of messages down the chain as well. Okay. It should pass the message along. So stronger stimuli cause neurons to fire more times, which then cause more neurons to fire at once to pass that message along. Now these signals pass between neurons across that gap called the synapse. Okay? Synapses can and do transmit especially chemicals, which are called neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are chemicals that send these nervous system messages specifically. Now, what we just talked about was a neuron that was receiving information from the surface of the body, right? It's communicating information about this needle, which is jamming into the skin. Okay? This is what's called a sensory neuron. They're part of your sensory systems, and they're collecting information from your environment. But there are going to be other neurons elsewhere in the body that connect to effectors. Effectors, remember, are things like your muscles. These neurons are called terminal neurons, and we say they innervate effectors, meaning they're found inside of effectors. These terminal neurons carry commands that tell the effectors what to do. This is ultimately what results in what we describe as a behavior. So neurons can either be sensory, where they're collecting sensory information, or they can innervate effectors, where they're going to cause movement or behaviors to occur. Now, we could talk a lot about the nervous system and how it interacts with behavior, but we're going to just cover a couple of key ideas. The first is the idea of neural plasticity. People often have the misapprehension that the nervous system is static. It can't change. Once it's developed, it's permanent. But that's not actually true. Your nervous system can alter its structure or its function in order to facilitate behavioral change if that behavioral change enhances your ability to survive or reproduce. Okay? We call this neural plasticity because plasticity implies flexibility, changeability. Spatial learning in rats is a great example. You can teach rats to navigate what's called a water maze. And you've got two visual examples of them down here. You've got two different groups, an experimental group of rats and a control group. The experimental group are run through these water mazes. Now, the first time you put the rat in the water maze, it tends to wander around. It's swimming in circles, it can't touch the bottom, and it also can't see this platform, which is hidden just below the surface of the water. Instead, the rats are looking for a way out, checking the walls of the pool until finally they stumble upon the hidden platform, and then they're able to haul themselves out of the water, which is their goal all along. Now, you run rats through these water mazes over and over again, leaving the platform in the same place. And what you find is that over time, the rats locate the platform faster and faster, until finally, when you put the rat into the water maze, no matter where you place it, it will always swim straight to the platform. It's learned where the platform is located. So in this experiment, rats are trained to locate this platform in this water maze, and then their brains are dissected and compared to a control group of rats who have never experienced the water maze at all. They've had no learning tests, which means no water maze experience. They've never had to learn to navigate that water environment. What you find is that your treatment group, which remember is your experimental group, The neurons in their brains have more dendritic spines than the neurons in the brains of the control group. This is only true after spatial learning exercises. All control group rats, all the rats who have never seen a water maze, have about the same number of dendritic spines. It's only the rats who have run through water mazes that experience an increase in the number of dendritic spines, and this is likely a direct result of their learning experience. Their neurons change shape to accommodate that new information and that new learned ability. So it's just an example that the brain itself will physically change to facilitate behavioral changes, such as a navigational ability. One more example of neuroplasticity. We're going to continue to talk about nervous system changes over the course of the remaining unit as well. Spatial navigation in honeybees. This one's kind of fun. So bee brains are tiny, but they're reasonably complex. You can see a diagram of one here in the bottom right. Spatial navigation means the ability to navigate through your environment and remember where you are relative to landmarks. This ability is mediated by a special part of the brain called the mushroom bodies. Okay? They're in red here in this diagram, so let me highlight those for you. Okay? So these red structures, there's one on each side of the brain, left and right. Those are the mushroom bodies. Okay? You see them here. Okay? So this diagram in the lower right is actually just one region of the brain. The brain's a little bit more elaborate than this. Okay? Mushroom bodies are larger in size in foraging honeybees. Okay? Foragers, as a reminder, are the animals that search for food and bring it back to the colony. Okay? Any animal that is searching for food in its environment is said to be foraging. So to see what the effect of the actual act of foraging was on mushroom body development, researchers created a very special colony of bees. Now, usually, honeybees, right after they emerge from their cells as adults, stay in the colony for the first 19 to 21 days of their lives. They act as nurse bees for other juveniles, they help keep the colony clean, and it isn't until they're about 21 days old that they actually leave the colony for the first time and go try to find food. What these researchers did was they created a colony of bees where every adult bee in the colony was 1 day old. The whole colony consisted of bees that had hatched within the previous, or had emerged as adults within the previous 24 hours. Now remember, bees usually don't leave the colony to forage until they're about 3 weeks old. There were no foragers left in this colony because all these bees were too young. But in the absence of foragers, food starts to run short. The colony has to adjust. So what happens is early foraging behavior is induced at either 3 or 4 days old for a certain number of bees in the colony. It means a certain subset of these 1 day old bees started to experience pressure to change into foragers much earlier in order to provide food for the rest of the colony. So instead of waiting until they're 21 days old, these bees now start foraging when they're only 3 or 4 days old. What we found is that when you dissect the brains of these foragers after they've been foraging for a few days or maybe up to a week, and you compare their brains to the brains of bees who never left the colony but are the same age, so perhaps you're comparing the brains now of 9-day-old foragers, and you're comparing them to the brains of 9-day-old nest bees, meaning bees who have not left the nest. These are probably your normal bees, you could call them. Here's what you find. Your foragers here develop much larger mushroom bodies than their nest mates of the same age, which are these bees. What this means is the act of foraging itself actually forces an increase in the size of the mushroom bodies in order to accommodate all the new behaviors and all the new learning these individuals have to do in order to navigate through their environment, find new food sources, and then remember their way back to the nest. It's another example of neuroplasticity, that the brain has to grow and change in response to changes in the animal's lifestyle that require a new suite of behaviors or responses. All right, that's it for this lecture, and I'll see you next time.